Welcome back to CDC Journal. Today we're diving into a topic that's quietly shaping Canada's future, our falling birth rate. We're joined here today by Michael Bonner, author of The Desperate Need for a Baby Bump, part of our Restoring Canada series. In his article, Michael lays out why declining fertility isn't just a private or personal matter. It's a serious national issue that affects our economy, public services, and long-term stability. Michael, welcome. It's great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Michael's piece looks at our steady decline in Canada's birth rate since the late 1950s. He explains that while many institutions frame this trend as progress, less population means less strain on the planet. But the reality is far more concerning. A shrinking population puts pressure on everything from healthcare to pensions to immigration systems and workforce sustainability. Michael argues that relying solely on immigration to fill the gap is not a long-term solution and that ignoring fertility decline risks weakening the country from within. He calls for a cultural and policy shift to help rebuild Canada's birth rate and secure its future. All right, well, let's get into our questions. So, Michael, what was the first thing that got you thinking about Canada's birth rate as a national emergency rather than just a family planning issue?
That's a very good question. The first time I heard about this issue was actually in high school.
Oh.
Um, they talked about the so-called graying of the population, and we were introduced to demographic pyramids and that sort of thing. And the conclusion, this was back in the 90s, the conclusion was, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about it.
Hmm.
And I've always thought that that didn't seem right, and that if what we were told was true, and I think it is, namely that building a social welfare state that presupposes a population of young taxable workers that's constantly growing and that's larger than the retired population.
Hmm.
If that's the economic model that we have, then we need to look more seriously at anything that would threaten the size of our population and hamper growth.
Hmm.
So, I've been thinking about this for a long time. Maybe other people have, but it doesn't seem to crop up very much uh,
No.
within popular discourse until very recently, a matter of weeks ago, a report issued by one of the branches of the United Nations
Hmm.
pointed out that this is now becoming a global concern and made a couple of, observations on it in different international contexts. And I thought, well, maybe it's time to revisit this.
And to talk about it more, absolutely. So you also describe Canada's fertility decline as a part of a broader global collapse. What does that look like in practical terms?
Well, in practical terms, I think it's in the bigger picture may be very difficult to predict simply because there are so many variables. But the first thing we need to understand is that if present trends continue, the the entire population of the world will be shrinking
Mhm.
by the end of this century.
Mhm.
And you know, there are it may shrink faster in some places than in others. If you look at a place like Korea, where um, the fertility rate has been below replacement for a
Mhm.
very long time, and it's getting lower and lower and lower. There are alarmist scenarios in which, the country dies out entirely. Now, I'm not sure I agree that that's likely to happen, but a smaller world population suggests to me a less creative one, a less economically dynamic world, a world that is generally older
Mhm.
than it is younger, and you know that doesn't necessarily. bode well for many of the technological or cultural aspirations that many countries have. In the case of Canada, it's I think it goes straight to our it would be a challenge to our self-image.
Mhm.
This idea of a welcoming country, one that is open to the world, in which the multicultural order has prevailed for quite some time. Well, that won't that won't be there if there aren't a large number of newcomers
Mhm.
anymore. And if the world population shrinks, then I think it's reasonable to predict that there won't be a huge surplus population of people seeking their fortune here. Now, apart from that, if the population is shrinking under its own power to begin with, that means that there's less money available for the welfare state.
Right.
You have a larger portion of retired persons than I think anybody ever predicted in the middle of the 20th century.
Mhm.
And that will force some very difficult political conversations and political decisions.
Mhm.
Does the welfare state survive? Does it get cut? Do parts of it get privatized even more so than now? Does it usher in a world of much higher taxes for millennials and Generation Z
Mhm.
and Generation X?
Mhm.
Um, does it become, do our politics become more, for lack of a better word, crotchety and inflexible and so forth? These these general trends, I think, are possible to foresee quite clearly. Exactly how they then sort of ramify themselves, I think
Mhm.
we're going to find out.
We are absolutely. I think there's a common belief that a smaller population is actually better for the planet, and you obviously challenge this idea. So can you walk us through a little bit as to why smaller population isn't actually good for the planet? I know you touched on this a little bit, but yeah, if we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So this is a mistake that goes back at least to Malthus, an English clergyman.
Mhm.
Um, the idea that that wealth is measured in arable land and that the population can only get so big before the resources run out, and then famine, scarcity, and so forth are the outcomes.
Mhm.
There are so many reasons why this is wrong,
Mhm.
but and it has led to some really horrible outcomes,
Mhm.
as I point out. Malthus has been the excuse for letting the poor die, avoiding feeding them and so forth, and was even more alarmingly was an influence on Hitler. We don't need to get into that. I can illustrate it very simply. The population now is higher than it has ever been, and
Mhm.
we are all now richer than we ever have been.
Mhm.
Famines and extreme poverty have become increasingly rare, even since the 20th century. And the resources available have grown thanks to human ingenuity and so forth as the population has grown.
Right.
I've heard many times people talk about how a smaller human population is, better for the environment. I'm not sure that that's true either. I think that what's good for the environment is in many cases also what's good for human beings, insofar as we can learn how to coexist with it better and to manage our resources better, all of which are byproducts of ingenuity and creativity, which come with a higher population. To me, I think that so far that's irrefutable,
Mhm.
considering the history of the mid 20th century down to the present.
Mhm.
And I would think, a smaller population will be a poorer one, or a world of a smaller population will be a poorer one, as we saw in the early to mid 20th century.
Right. So instead of encouraging people to have more children, particularly in Canada, Canada relies on immigration to offset this population decline. And you talk about why that's not a sustainable solution. So can you walk us through like why this isn't the best way to go forward to fix this issue?
Well, first of all, I should say I think that we should always be open to, the best and brightest in the world.
Right.
But the number of such people, I argue, is bound to get smaller as the population of the world gets smaller.
Mhm.
And other countries are in the same position as we are in, and some are more advanced down the road of the demographic crisis, or the graying of the population that we've been hearing about since the 90s.
Mhm.
So if if you think about it, it seems perfectly reasonable to think that countries that have gone through the demographic transition that we've been describing, that they will try harder to hold on to their own best and brightest.
Mhm.
And whether they do or they don't, there will simply be fewer such people seeking their fortunes abroad. And you can see this in the way immigration to Canada has evolved over the past 100 years or so. It was for a long time, it was Western Europe,
Mhm.
Middle, and then Eastern Europe, where there were large surplus populations seeking escape from turmoil at home or looking for economic opportunities abroad.
Mhm.
That has dwindled over time, and now we've had very different source countries. Most recently, the biggest one is India.
Mhm.
India itself is also going through this same transition, arguably more rapidly than Europe did. In
Mhm.
which case, is it possible really to foresee that the same numbers that we have relied upon will still be there? I would argue no. And if that's the case, we need a different model of population and economic growth.
Absolutely. You also talk about the fact that the falling birth rate has other consequences and affects things like pensions, our healthcare system, and economic growth. Can you talk a little bit more about those consequences?
Yeah, the basic idea is that the structure of the welfare state was based on having a larger taxable population than the population of retired persons,
Mhm.
and also to a certain extent of younger dependents because they don't work, right? So a healthy population pyramid is wide at the bottom, and then it supposedly narrows like a pyramid, right?
Right.
That's the case in increasingly fewer countries in the world. It's more of like I think they call it a chimney. And in some cases, it's inverted, which would be really bad.
Mhm.
Now, the fact of the matter is that if your welfare state is getting more generous, and at the same time your taxable population is getting smaller,
Mhm.
then you are in what I would argue to be a bad position, a dangerous one, in which there's a huge temptation to either just tax more,
Mhm.
which has a limit,
Mhm.
and to borrow more. And this is exactly the position that countries like Canada have found themselves in.
Mhm.
Now, um, the consequences of this, I think you can see they have different ramifications in different parts of the world.
Mhm.
Japan is
Mhm.
an example of this, where there's been a long period of just sort of stagnancy, and population has sort of remained at a sort of uniform level of productivity, and the economy is, neither neither growing nor shrinking.
Mhm.
Korea is another such
Mhm.
example. China, you can, if you compare the growth that China is having now to what it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago, there's a sort of steady slowing. And China's population, famously in recent years, began to shrink,
Mhm.
giving way to India as the most populous country in the world. Now, in Canada, I think that what we are faced with is just a sort of growing, sluggishness,
Mhm.
and um, there will be difficult political discussions that will have to be had,
Yeah.
ranging from things like raising the retirement age, or postponing some benefits.
Mhm.
Uh, the third rail of Canadian politics, privatizing healthcare.
Mhm.
That's something that will almost certainly be talked about.
Mhm.
Um, Higher taxation, which would create political problems on the younger working generation.
Mhm.
Um, you know, there are all sorts of things that we can imagine happening here. Um, and of course, they would all be happening at once, which would
Right.
mean that there would be different, they would sort of ramify in different and unpredictable ways. And this is why I say that, in some ways we're thinking about this too late. We should have been
Mhm.
thinking about this before, but, the second best time is now.
Yes, no, absolutely. Well, on that, you in your article you mentioned that this has been quietly building up for decades, but this issue hasn't really received much attention until now. Why do you think that is? Why hasn't this been widely talked about?
To be quite frank, I don't know.
Mhm.
But the plain, the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of crises, or things that people think about
Mhm.
that turn out not to be uh, uh, particularly important, or they
Mhm.
turn out to be much more important than anybody thought.
Mhm.
Y2K, I mean, everybody worried about the so-called millennium bug in the late 1990s, and as far as I know, that didn't really amount to anything.
Mhm.
People were extremely upset about the possibility of overpopulation,
Mhm.
um, throughout much of the 20th century.
Mhm.
And we are now faced with um, the exact opposite problem. But, you know, uh, in the Canadian context, the response, I've noticed that there have always been two responses.
Mhm.
One is, well, there's nothing we can do about this, so, we're just going to think about something else.
Mhm.
The other is, immigration is always going to be there.
Mhm.
And if there's one thing I want people to take from this, it's the idea that that isn't something that we can count on.
Mhm.
I'm sure that there will still be people who want to move around, but there will
Right.
not be so many that um, rich countries like Canada will be able to have their choice of them, and certainly not in the numbers that we've seen over the past decade. I mean, the idea of, 300, 400,000 people moving here every single year, or, millions of new permanent residents, for the next 100 years.
Mhm.
I'm not convinced that that's a realistic possibility.
Absolutely. And what is your opinion on how Canada should tackle this issue? And like what should they start doing, policy wise or culturally to support a higher birth rate in Canada?
Well, that's an interesting question. Now, the people who have confronted this issue off and on over the years, periodically, they say they tend to say one thing. They say, well, we can't just ask people to have more kids.
Mhm.
And, when I was a teenager, when I first heard this, I thought, well, why not? Why can't you?
Mhm.
But there's a sense in which they're right. And the reason for that is that families are not having the number of children that they actually want.
Mhm.
That's a general, on average, typically they are not having as many as they want. If people did, the country would actually be much closer to the replacement level, if not maybe right at replacement.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm not just saying this. This has been pointed out in the Canadian context in studies before. Most recently in 2023, there was a study prepared by a fellow by the name of Lyman Stone, a demographer, and again, within recent weeks, the report that I mentioned about from the United Nations about fertility, this is the exact point that that report makes on a global scale, that respondents say that they want to have more kids than they are able to have.
Mhm.
So the idea that we would then just invite people to do it, that's not going to work. There are uh, uh, clearly barriers, as they
Mhm.
say, or there's something is getting in the way of making this happen.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the same in every country, but there still may be things that in the Canadian context we can learn from practices abroad or from problems that are discussed abroad. However, I think it's reasonable to assume in the Canadian context that the cost of housing would be one major limiting
Huge.
factor.
Mhm.
The fact that infrastructure hasn't kept pace with the population growth by immigration, and that there's a sort of a general feeling of scarcity, especially in our big cities, um, and a general strain that people have been feeling for some time when it comes to social services
Mhm.
and so forth. If we could do something about all that, I think we would be in a better position. But of course, there are other factors that you might call cultural or even spiritual
Mhm.
that should be taken much more seriously.
Mhm.
I've been talking this whole time about things like, GDP, GDP per capita, productivity,
Mhm.
and the solvency of the welfare state. But, you know, we we may need to change our minds here, and I think in many cases we have to, that what makes for a prosperous, happy, productive society is one in which people and children are loved and valued
Mhm.
for their own sake, not because there's some not because they need to feed some kind of economic machine. Thinking of people as economic inputs, I think is completely the wrong way to go about this matter. And if if young couples are not having kids because it's too burdensome or too difficult,
Mhm.
or it's somehow it doesn't feel like a socially rewarding thing to do,
Mhm.
then we have a far deeper problem, I
Mhm.
would say, than simply uh, keeping a social welfare state alive, although that in and of itself is also
No,
an
I
important.
completely agree. I mean, there's several factors. It's not just economic and the rise of, housing. I think there's also a bit of a social movement that ties into, a lot of people wanting to be child free.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's quite a bit to unpack there for sure. So finally, to all our listeners and to those who haven't really thought of this topic much, because again, we talked about how this isn't really a mainstream conversation that we're having. What's one of the key takeaways that you want our audience to take from your article and from our discussion today?
I want people to start thinking about and discussing the issue. I mean, I don't know if I don't know if the question has been taboo
Mhm.
or what. It probably isn't, but for some reason it just hasn't been a topic of conversation in policy circles, despite the fact that it has come up from time to time.
Mhm.
But if one compares it to other issues, uh, climate change or the um, financial crisis or uh, warfare, these have occupied much more energy and space in our minds. And I think it's now time to think about this. The other problems that, we face now, they are problems that we've always faced
Mhm.
as a species and as a culture. This question of a declining population, it seems new. It seems unprecedented. Um, Certainly within living memory outside of wartime or epidemic disease. But if one thinks about past catastrophes, the Black Death, uh, the Spanish flu, COVID, and again warfare, the 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 social cultural cost of of rapid declines in population have been enormous and have changed history in many cases for the worse. And if there's anything that we can do to remedy this situation, we should try.
Mhm.
And the first step is to start talking and thinking about it.
Absolutely. Michael, thank you so much for being here and sharing your perspective on this very important issue. You've shown us that fertility isn't just a personal choice, it's a national concern that touches every corner of society. To learn more about this topic, please read the full article, The Desperate Need for a Baby Bump. You can find it linked down in our description below. Michael, again, thanks so much for being here, and thank you to everybody for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.